The stallion reared without warning, hooves slashing the gray morning air, and every man near the stable yard scattered except one woman who stood her ground. Edmund Ashworth watched from the top of the stone steps, his breath catching as the animal's scream tore through the quiet of Ashworth Hall. He had seen grown men run from that horse. He had seen his own head groom refuse to enter its stall without a whip in hand. Yet the woman below did not flinch. She lowered her shoulders, turned her body slightly away from the horse, and spoke in a low, steady voice that Edmund could not quite hear from where he stood, but somehow felt in his own chest. The stallion's ears twitched. Its front legs came down slowly, unevenly, like a storm losing its fury. Within a minute, the animal that had thrown 3 different handlers in the past month was standing quietly beside her, its great head lowered until its nose nearly touched her shoulder. Edmund realized he had been holding his breath the entire time. He did not know her name yet. He only knew that something about the way she moved through danger without fear had unsettled the careful, arranged life he had built for himself, a life that was supposed to be simple from this point forward. He was to marry Lady Constance Whitmore within the season. Everything had already been decided, sealed in letters between his father and hers, wrapped neatly in the language of duty and family survival. There was no room in that plan for a woman who tamed wild horses in the stable yard. And yet, as Edmund walked down the steps toward her that morning, he had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling that his carefully arranged future was about to change in ways he could not yet predict. Ashworth Hall had once been among the finest estates in the county, its halls filled with laughter, its fields worked by tenants who trusted the family name. But years of poor harvests, a father who gambled more than he governed, and debts that multiplied like weeds had left the estate on the edge of ruin. Edmund had grown up watching the slow decline, watching his father sell off land piece by piece, watching servants leave because their wages could no longer be guaranteed. By the time Edmund reached his 28th year, the truth was plain to everyone in the household. Ashworth Hall would not survive another decade without a significant infusion of wealth. His father, Lord Henry Ashworth, had never been a subtle man. One evening, over a meal that consisted mostly of thin soup and stale bread, he had looked at his son and said the words that would shape the following months of Edmund's life. "There is a way to save this family," Henry had said, setting down his spoon. "The Whitmore family has wealth beyond anything we have seen in 20 years. Lord Whitmore has one daughter and no son to inherit. If you marry her, our name continues, our land is saved, and their fortune finds a proper family to belong to." Edmund had not argued. What was there to argue? He understood the numbers as well as his father did. He had seen the ledgers, the mounting debts, the desperate letters from creditors. He was a duke by title, though increasingly a duke of very little. Marrying Constance Whitmore was not a romantic notion. It was survival, plain and practical, the way one might repair a roof before winter or sell a horse to pay for grain. Constance herself was not unkind. When Edmund first met her at a dinner arranged by their fathers, she had been polite, well-spoken, and entirely reasonable about the entire arrangement. She did not pretend to love him, and he did not pretend to love her. They spoke instead about practical matters, about what their marriage would mean for both families, about how the estate might be restored once her father's money began to flow into its accounts. It was, in its own strange way, a comfortable arrangement, built on honesty rather than illusion. "I do not expect romance," Constance had told him during their second meeting, her eyes steady and unbothered. "I expect respect, and I expect that you will not embarrass me in society. Beyond that, I think we shall manage quite well." Edmund had agreed. He believed at the time that he could live a full life without love, so long as there was peace, stability, and the survival of everything his family had built over generations. He was not a man given to romantic fantasies. He had watched his own parents' marriage, built on genuine affection in its early years, crumble slowly under the weight of financial ruin and disappointment. Perhaps, he reasoned, a marriage built on practicality from the start would prove sturdier than one built on feelings that could fade. It was only 3 weeks before the wedding banns were to be read that Edmund first noticed Eliza Hartley. He had gone to the stables that morning for no particular reason, other than a restless feeling that had been building in him for days, a tightness in his chest that he could not quite explain. The wedding preparations consumed the household. Seamstresses arrived daily to fit Constance for her gown. Letters went back and forth between the two families discussing guest lists and seating arrangements. Edmund found himself wanting nothing more than a moment of quiet, and the stables, with their familiar smell of hay and leather, had always offered him that. He had not expected to find a young woman standing calmly beside his most dangerous horse, feeding it from her open palm as though it were the gentlest creature in the world. "You should step back," he had said, more out of concern than command. "That horse has injured 2 men this month alone." The woman had turned to look at him, unhurried, her expression neither frightened nor deferential in the way most of his servants greeted him. "He has never injured anyone who did not first frighten him," she said simply. "Animals remember fear. They return it." Edmund had blinked, caught off guard by her directness. Few people spoke to him so plainly, least of all servants, who typically bowed their heads and rushed through their duties whenever he appeared. This woman did neither. She continued stroking the stallion's neck, her fingers moving in slow, even circles, and the great animal leaned into her touch like a child seeking comfort. "What is your name?" Edmund had asked. "Eliza Hartley, my lord," she answered. "I help with the horses when Mr. Coleman needs an extra hand. My father worked these stables before me until his health failed him." Edmund had nodded slowly, filing the name away without quite understanding why it mattered to him. He watched her a moment longer, watched the horse calm further under her steady hands, and then, feeling suddenly foolish for lingering, he excused himself and returned to the house. But he found himself thinking about her for the rest of the day. Not in any improper way, he told himself. He was simply curious about a servant with such an unusual gift, a woman who could calm an animal that had defeated every experienced handler on the estate. That was all it was, curiosity. He returned to the stables the following morning, and the morning after that, each time telling himself it was to check on the stallion's progress, to ensure the horse remained safe to handle before the wedding, when guests and carriages would fill the estate grounds. Each time he found Eliza there, working quietly, speaking to the animals in that same low, steady voice that seemed to calm not only the horses but something restless in Edmund himself. She was not beautiful in the way society defined beauty, not dressed in silk or powdered in the fashion of the ladies who attended his family's dinners. Her hands were rough from work, her dress simple, and often marked with dust from the stable floor. But there was something in the way she carried herself, and quiet confidence, an honesty in her expression that Edmund found he could not look away from. "You come here often for a man who is soon to be married," Eliza said one morning, not looking up from the saddle she was repairing. Edmund felt his face grow warm, though he was not entirely sure why her words had affected him so directly. "I am checking on the horse," he said, "ensuring he will behave for the wedding guests." Eliza glanced up at him then, and for a brief moment something like amusement flickered across her face. "Of course, my lord." She did not believe him. He was not entirely sure he believed himself either. Over the following days, their conversations grew slightly longer, though never improper, never overstepping the clear boundaries that separated a duke from a servant girl. She spoke to him about the horses, about the small details of stable life he had never bothered to notice before, about the way certain animals remembered kindness the same way they remembered cruelty. He found himself listening more carefully to her than he listened to anyone else in his household, including his own father, including Constance. There was an honesty to Eliza that Edmund had not encountered anywhere else in his life. Everyone around him, from his father to the servants to Constance herself, spoke to him with careful consideration, always aware of his title, always measuring their words. Eliza spoke to him as though he were simply a man, no better and no worse than anyone else who happened to walk into her stable. It was, he realized, deeply refreshing and deeply dangerous, given everything that had already been decided about his future. He told himself repeatedly that his growing interest in her was nothing more than curiosity, a passing distraction from the stress of his upcoming marriage. He told himself this even as he found reasons to visit the stables nearly every day, even as he found himself remembering small details of their conversations long after he had returned to the main house, even as he began to notice the particular sound of her laughter, rare as it was, and how it seemed to loosen something tight in his chest. Lady Margaret, his mother, noticed his frequent absences before anyone else did. "You have been spending a great deal of time at the stables lately," she remarked one evening, as they sat together in the drawing room, the fire crackling low against the encroaching autumn chill. "Is something troubling the horses?" "Nothing troubling," Edmund said, perhaps too quickly. "I simply find it peaceful there." His mother studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before returning her attention to the needlework in her lap. She said nothing further that evening, but Edmund noticed, in the days that followed, that her eyes seemed to follow him more closely than before, as though she were beginning to piece together a puzzle he himself did not yet fully understand. The wedding to Constance drew closer with each passing day. Seamstresses finished her gown. The guest list grew longer. Letters arrived from distant relatives confirming their attendance. Everything moved forward exactly as planned, exactly as arranged between two families who understood the practical necessity of the union. And yet, in the quiet hours of early morning, before the household stirred, Edmund found himself walking to the stables, drawn there by something he could not name and was not yet ready to examine too closely. He told himself it would pass. He told himself that once he was married, once the estate's debts were settled and the future secured, this strange restlessness would fade, and he would settle into the practical, respectful marriage he had agreed to. He told himself many things during those quiet mornings. But standing in the stable doorway, watching Eliza Hartley speak softly to a horse that trusted her completely, Edmund began to suspect that some things, once noticed, could not simply be unnoticed again. And some feelings once stirred, however inconvenient their timing, however impossible their circumstances, did not fade quietly away. He did not yet know what he would do about it. He only knew that the careful, arranged future he had accepted without question 3 weeks earlier no longer felt as certain as it once had. Something had shifted inside him, quietly, without his permission, and Edmund Ashworth, Duke of a crumbling estate, soon to be married for money rather than love, found himself standing at the edge of a decision he had never expected to face. The wedding was still weeks away. There was time, he told himself, to sort out these confusing feelings, to remind himself of his duty, to remember exactly why the marriage to Constance mattered so deeply to his family's survival. There was time. But as he watched Eliza guide the once wild stallion gently back into its stall, patting its neck with the same quiet tenderness she showed every creature under her care, Edmund could not shake the growing feeling that time, in this particular matter, might not be entirely on his side. Rain fell steadily over Ashworth Hall the next morning, drumming against the tall windows of the breakfast room where Edmund sat across from his father, neither man speaking. Lord Henry read through a stack of letters, his brow furrowed with the particular tension that always accompanied news from creditors. Edmund stirred his tea without drinking it, his thoughts drifting, as they had every morning that week, toward the stables and the woman who worked there. "You seem distracted lately," Henry said without looking up from his letters. "I trust nothing is wrong." "Nothing is wrong," Edmund replied, setting down his cup a little too firmly. "I have simply had much on my mind with the wedding approaching." Henry finally looked up, studying his son with the sharp, assessing gaze that had once made Edmund feel like a small boy again, even now, well into adulthood. "The wedding is the best thing to happen to this family in a generation. I would advise you to keep your mind firmly fixed upon it, and nowhere else." Edmund said nothing, though the words settled uncomfortably in his chest. He wondered, not for the first time, whether his father somehow already sensed the direction his thoughts had begun to wander, though he told himself that was impossible. He had said nothing to anyone. He had done nothing improper. He had simply visited the stables more often than usual, spoken with a servant about horses, allowed himself moments of quiet conversation that meant nothing beyond simple companionship. And yet, when he closed his eyes that night, it was not Constance's composed, practical face he saw, but Eliza's, illuminated by the pale morning light of the stable yard, her attention fixed entirely on the animal in her care, unaware or unconcerned that a duke stood watching her with growing fascination. The following days brought him back to the stables again and again, each visit stretching longer than the last. He learned, through careful and unhurried conversation, that Eliza's family had once held a modest but respectable position in a neighboring village, before misfortune arrived in the form of a fire that destroyed their small farm and left her father unable to work the land any longer. They had come to Ashworth Hall seeking any employment that would keep a roof over their heads, and Eliza, even as a young girl, had shown a remarkable gift with animals that no one had taught her, a patience and understanding that seemed to come from somewhere deep and instinctive within her. "My father always said horses know the truth of a person," Eliza told him one afternoon, brushing down a mare with slow, careful strokes. "They cannot be fooled by fine words or fancy clothes. They know kindness when they feel it, and they know fear, even when a person tries to hide it behind confidence." "And what do they know of me?" Edmund asked, surprising himself with the question. Eliza paused, considering him for a long moment before answering. "I think they know you are kinder than you allow yourself to appear, my lord. You watch everything so carefully, as though you are afraid of taking up too much space in your own life." Edmund felt something tighten in his chest at her words, an uncomfortable recognition of a truth he had never spoken aloud to anyone. He had spent his entire life carefully managing expectations, carefully measuring his own desires against the needs of his family and his estate, until he had nearly forgotten what it felt like to want something simply because he wanted it, without calculation, without duty attached. He did not respond to her observation, uncertain of what he might say if he allowed himself to speak honestly. Instead, he changed the subject, asking about the mare's training, retreating to safer, more practical conversation. But the words stayed with him long after he left the stables that day, echoing in his mind during the quiet hours of the evening, when the house grew still and his thoughts had nowhere left to hide. Constance arrived at Ashworth Hall 3 days later for a planning meeting regarding the wedding ceremony, accompanied by her mother and a small entourage of assistants carrying fabric samples and seating charts. Edmund greeted her in the main hall with the polite formality that had characterized their entire courtship, offering his arm as they walked together toward the drawing room where the meeting would take place. "You seem tired," Constance observed as they walked, her voice carrying the same practical directness it always had. "Is the estate causing you difficulty?" "Simply the usual concerns," Edmund said, "nothing beyond what we have already discussed." Constance studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful rather than suspicious, though Edmund could not shake the feeling that she saw more than she let on. She had always possessed a sharp mind, capable of reading between the lines of careful conversation, and though their relationship had never been built on deep emotional connection, there existed between them a mutual respect that made outright deception feel deeply uncomfortable to Edmund, even in matters he had not yet fully admitted to himself. The planning meeting stretched through the afternoon, filled with discussions of flower arrangements, guest seating, and the precise timing of the ceremony. Edmund contributed where necessary, offering opinions on matters that felt increasingly distant from his actual concerns, his mind repeatedly drifting toward the stable yard despite his best efforts to remain present in the conversation. When Constance finally departed that evening, she paused at the door, turning back to look at him with an expression he could not quite interpret. "Edmund," she said quietly, "whatever is troubling you, I would rather know now than discover it after we are married. I have no interest in beginning our life together with secrets between us." "There is nothing to discover," Edmund said, though even as the words left his mouth, he heard the hollowness in them, and he suspected Constance heard it too. She did not press the matter further that evening, simply nodding once before climbing into her carriage and departing into the darkening evening. Edmund stood alone on the front steps of Ashworth Hall for a long time after she left, watching the carriage disappear down the long drive, his mind churning with questions he was not yet prepared to answer, not even to himself. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself walking the grounds of the estate long after the household had retired, his footsteps eventually leading him, as they so often did now, toward the stables. He told himself he simply needed air, needed space to think clearly, away from the pressures of the main house. He did not expect to find anyone else awake at such a late hour. But a single lantern burned faintly in the stable, and through the open door, Edmund saw Eliza sitting on an overturned crate beside the stallion's stall, her knees drawn up, her expression troubled in a way he had not seen before. "You are awake late," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. Eliza looked up, and for a moment something like embarrassment crossed her face, quickly replaced by her usual quiet composure. "My father has taken ill again, my lord. I could not sleep for worry, so I came here instead. The horses do not mind my restlessness the way a quiet house does." Edmund stepped further into the stable, lowering himself onto a nearby bench, close enough to speak without shouting but respectfully distant. "I am sorry to hear of your father's illness. Is there anything the estate can provide? A physician, perhaps?" "You are very kind, my lord," Eliza said, though there was a weariness in her voice that told him this was not the first sleepless night she had endured. "But I fear some illnesses cannot be cured by physicians alone. He grows weaker each season, and there is little to be done beyond keeping him comfortable." They sat together in silence for a while, the only sounds the soft shuffling of horses settling into their stalls, and the distant call of a night bird somewhere beyond the stable walls. Edmund found himself unwilling to leave, unwilling to break the fragile, quiet connection that had settled between them, even as every practical consideration in his mind urged him toward caution. "May I ask you something?" Eliza said eventually, breaking the silence. "Of course. Do you love her, Lady Constance?" The question hung in the air between them, more direct than anything Eliza had asked him before. Edmund considered his answer carefully, aware that whatever he said next would matter in ways he could not fully predict. "I respect her greatly," he said slowly. "We understand each other well, and I believe we could build a comfortable life together, but love in the way poets describe it, the way it is spoken of in stories." He paused, searching for honest words. "No, I do not think I love her in that way. I am not certain I ever expected to feel such a thing, given the circumstances of our arrangement." Eliza nodded slowly, her expression unreadable in the dim lantern light. "That seems a difficult way to enter a marriage, my lord, without expecting to feel anything more than comfortable respect." "It is the way of things for men in my position," Edmund said, though even as he spoke the words, they felt increasingly hollow, increasingly like an excuse he had been repeating to himself for so long that he had nearly convinced himself of its truth. "Perhaps," Eliza said quietly, "though I have always believed that a person's position should not determine the shape of their heart." Edmund looked at her then, really looked at her, taking in the tired lines around her eyes from worry over her father, the quiet strength in the way she carried herself despite the difficulties life had handed her, the honesty that colored every word she spoke to him without pretense or calculation. Something in his chest ached with a feeling he had spent weeks trying to name, and had finally, in this quiet moment, run out of ways to deny. He did not act on the feeling that night. He simply sat with her a while longer, offering what comfort he could regarding her father's health, before eventually returning to the main house as the first hints of dawn began to color the eastern sky. But as he walked back across the dew-covered grounds of Ashworth Hall, Edmund understood, with a clarity that both frightened and steadied him, that his feelings for Eliza Hartley were no longer something he could dismiss as passing curiosity. He was falling in love with a woman he was not supposed to notice, at the exact moment his entire future had already been arranged around someone else. And somewhere in the quiet, honest exchange they had shared beneath the lantern light, Edmund began to suspect that the practical, respectful marriage he had accepted without question might no longer be enough to satisfy the man he was slowly becoming. The wedding to Constance remained scheduled. The estate's debts remained unpaid. Nothing about his circumstances had changed. But something within Edmund himself had shifted permanently, and he knew, walking alone through the gray light of early morning, that there would be no simple way to undo what had already taken root in his heart. The following morning, Edmund summoned the estate's physician without telling anyone why, and sent him quietly to the small cottage where Eliza's father lived at the edge of the property. He told himself it was simply an act of kindness owed to a loyal family who had served the estate for decades, nothing more. But when Eliza discovered what he had done, arriving breathless at the stable doorway where he happened to be standing that afternoon, her eyes bright with unshed tears of gratitude, Edmund understood that his motives had been far less simple than he pretended. "You did not need to do that," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We could never afford to repay such kindness." "I do not require repayment," Edmund said. "Your father has served this estate faithfully for many years. It is only right that the estate cares for him in return." Eliza studied him for a long moment, and Edmund had the distinct impression that she saw straight through his careful explanation to the truth beneath it. She said nothing further about the matter, but something shifted between them that day. A barrier lowered. A trust deepened that neither of them spoke aloud but both clearly felt. The physician's visit revealed that Eliza's father suffered from a weakness of the heart, a condition that could be managed with rest and proper medicine, but never fully cured. The news brought Eliza both relief and continued worry, and in the days that followed, Edmund found himself visiting the stables not only to see her, but to ask after her father's condition, genuinely invested in the well-being of a family he had scarcely known existed a month earlier. Their conversations grew deeper during this time, no longer confined to horses and stable work. Eliza spoke of her childhood before the fire that destroyed her family's farm, of long summer evenings spent in fields now lost to memory, of a mother who had died when Eliza was still young, leaving her father to raise her alone. Edmund found himself sharing things he had never spoken of to anyone, not even Constance, not even his own mother. He told Eliza of the crushing weight of watching his family's fortune decline year after year, of the guilt he carried for being unable to prevent it, of the quiet resentment he sometimes felt toward a title that demanded everything of him while offering so little genuine freedom in return. "You speak of your title as though it were a cage," Eliza observed one evening, as they walked slowly along the fence line bordering the eastern pasture, the horses grazing peacefully in the fading light. "Perhaps it is," Edmund admitted. "Every decision I make is measured against what is expected of a duke, what will preserve the family name, what will secure the estate's future. I have rarely been permitted to simply want something for myself." "And what do you want, Edmund?" Eliza asked, using his given name for the first time without title, without the careful distance that had always separated them. The sound of it, spoken so plainly, sent a warmth through his chest that he could not have anticipated. He did not answer immediately, uncertain how honest he dared to be. But standing there beside her, the evening light catching the gold in her hair, the quiet strength of her presence beside him, Edmund felt the answer rising within him with a clarity he could no longer ignore. "I want honesty," he said finally. "I want a life built on something more than practical arrangement. I want to feel when I wake each morning that the choices shaping my future are truly my own." He paused, looking at her directly. "And I find more and more that when I imagine such a life, it is not Constance's face I see beside me." The words hung between them, heavier than anything either had spoken before. Eliza's breath caught, and for a long moment she said nothing, her eyes searching his with an expression that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. "You cannot say such things to me, my lord," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It would ruin us both. You have a duty to your family, to your name. I have nothing to offer that could ever compare to what Lady Constance brings to this marriage. Her father's fortune could save this entire estate. What could I possibly offer in comparison?" "You offer honesty," Edmund said. "You offer a version of myself I did not know existed before I met you, a man who is not constantly calculating, constantly measuring every word and action against duty. I did not ask for these feelings, Eliza. I fought against them for weeks, telling myself they were nothing more than distraction. But I cannot deny them any longer, not to you and not to myself. Eliza took a step back, shaking her head slowly, though Edmund could see the effort it cost her to maintain her composure. Please, do not speak of this again. I beg you. If anyone were to hear such words, it would destroy my family's position here, and it would bring shame upon your name at the very moment you need your reputation most secure. The wedding is in a matter of weeks. Nothing can change that now. She turned and walked quickly back toward the stables, leaving Edmund standing alone in the fading light, his heart pounding with the weight of words he could not take back and did not truly wish to. He understood her fear, understood the very real danger his admission posed to her livelihood, her family's standing, everything she had worked to build in a world that offered so little protection to a woman in her position. But understanding her fear did nothing to diminish the truth of what he felt. Over the following days, Eliza kept a careful distance from him, finding reasons to be occupied elsewhere whenever he approached the stables, speaking to him with a formal politeness that felt like a wound after the honesty they had shared. Edmund respected her wishes, though every day apart from her felt increasingly unbearable, a slow ache that no amount of wedding preparation or estate business could distract him from. It was during this period of careful distance that George Pembroke arrived at Ashworth Hall, a long-time family friend and neighboring landowner who had recently returned from several years abroad. George had always possessed an easy charm, a natural warmth that made him popular among the household staff, and Edmund noticed, with a discomfort he did not entirely understand, that George's attention seemed particularly drawn to the stable yard during his visit, and to the woman who worked there. "That girl has quite a gift with horses," George remarked one evening, as the two men sat together in the drawing-room sharing a drink. "I noticed her calming a horse that 3 of your grooms could not handle. Remarkable, truly. I might inquire whether she would consider working at my own stables, given how well-suited she seems for such difficult animals." Edmund felt an unexpected surge of something sharp and possessive rise within him at George's words, a feeling he recognized with some discomfort as jealousy. He forced himself to remain composed, unwilling to reveal the true depth of his reaction. "She is quite valued here," he said carefully. "I doubt Mr. Coleman would wish to lose such a skilled hand." George studied him for a moment, a knowing smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Careful, Edmund. A man does not usually defend a stable girl's employment with such urgency unless something more is at play." "You misunderstand," Edmund said, perhaps too quickly. "I simply value good workers on my estate." George laughed lightly, clearly unconvinced, but he let the matter drop, turning the conversation toward other topics. Edmund spent the rest of the evening distracted, his thoughts circling back repeatedly to the uncomfortable realization of how strongly he had reacted to the mere suggestion of Eliza leaving Ashworth Hall for another estate. The thought of her working elsewhere, of not seeing her familiar figure in the stable yard each morning, felt like a loss he was entirely unprepared to accept. He found her the following morning, despite the careful distance she had maintained, unable to stay away any longer. She was mending a bridle near the tack room, her expression guarded when she noticed his approach. "Mr. Pembroke mentioned he might offer you a position at his own estate," Edmund said, watching her reaction carefully. Eliza looked up, surprised. "I had not heard such an offer." "Would you consider it if he made one?" Edmund asked, hating the vulnerability in his own voice but unable to hide it. Eliza set down the bridle slowly, studying him with an expression that softened slightly despite her earlier resolve to keep her distance. "My father's health keeps me here, my lord. I would not leave him, regardless of what any position might offer." Relief washed through Edmund, though he immediately felt foolish for how strongly it had affected him. "I am glad to hear it," he said simply. "Edmund," Eliza said quietly, using his name again despite her earlier warning against such familiarity, "you must understand that nothing has changed between us, regardless of how either of us might feel. Your marriage to Lady Constance will proceed. It must proceed for the sake of your family's survival. Whatever exists between us cannot alter that reality." "I know," Edmund said, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. "I know the practical truth of my circumstances better than anyone, but knowing something and accepting it as inevitable are not always the same thing, Eliza." She looked away, her jaw tight with an emotion she was clearly working hard to contain. "We cannot continue speaking this way. It serves neither of us well." Edmund nodded slowly, though every part of him rebelled against the idea of stepping back from the connection they had built. "Then tell me what you wish, and I will honor it, even if it costs me greatly." Eliza was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as though looking for something she could not quite name. "I wish for many things that circumstances will never allow me to have," she said finally, her voice barely steady. "But wishing changes nothing. You have a duty, and I have a family depending on my position here. We must both remember that, regardless of what our hearts might prefer." She returned to her work then, and Edmund, understanding that pressing further would only cause her greater distress, forced himself to walk away, though the ache in his chest followed him back to the main house and lingered long into the evening, a constant, unwelcome companion to every wedding preparation that unfolded around him in the days that followed. That night, alone in his study, Edmund stared at the ledgers detailing his family's debts, the numbers swimming before his tired eyes. He thought of Constance, patient and practical, waiting for a marriage built on mutual respect rather than passion. He thought of his father's warning, of the family name that depended on this union proceeding without complication. And he thought of Eliza, standing steady in the face of a wild horse that had thrown every other handler on the estate, unafraid, honest, real in a way that nothing else in his carefully arranged life had ever felt. He did not know, sitting there in the flickering candlelight, how he would resolve the impossible tangle his heart had created. But he knew, with growing certainty, that the wedding to Constance, once a simple matter of practical necessity, had become something far more complicated, a decision that would require him to choose, eventually, between the security his family desperately needed and the honest, unexpected love that had taken root within him despite every effort to prevent it. The weeks remaining before the wedding suddenly felt impossibly short, and impossibly long all at once. Constance Whitmore was not a woman easily fooled, and though she had agreed to a marriage built on practicality rather than passion, she had never intended to enter that marriage blind to the truth of her future husband's heart. She had noticed, over the past several weeks, a change in Edmund that troubled her more than she initially admitted even to herself. He seemed distracted during their meetings, his responses delayed, his attention frequently drifting toward the window that overlooked the estate grounds. When she mentioned wedding details, he agreed readily but without genuine interest, as though his mind occupied some other place entirely. It was during a visit to Ashworth Hall to finalize the guest arrangements that Constance decided to walk the grounds alone, ostensibly to admire the gardens, though her true purpose was to observe the household in a manner Edmund could not carefully manage or explain away. She made her way toward the stables, drawn there by nothing more than curiosity at first, having heard from her own household staff, who maintained friendly connections with servants across several estates, whispered rumors about a stable girl with an unusual gift for calming difficult horses, and a duke who visited that stable with unusual frequency. She found Eliza brushing down a mare in the quiet of the afternoon, unaware of Constance's approach. Constance paused at the stable entrance, studying the young woman for a long moment before making her presence known. "You must be the girl everyone speaks of," Constance said, her voice carrying the practiced composure of someone accustomed to controlling difficult conversations. Eliza turned, startled, quickly straightening and offering a respectful curtsy. "My lady, I did not realize you had arrived." "I imagine not," Constance said, stepping further into the stable, her eyes taking in every detail of the space, the well-tended horses, the careful order of tools and equipment. "You have quite a reputation, it seems, for your skill with animals that others cannot manage." I simply have patience with them, my lady. Nothing more remarkable than that. Constance studied her carefully, noting the quiet dignity in the young woman's bearing, the honest directness of her gaze, qualities that Constance recognized with a discomfort she had not expected, as similar to her own. She had always prided herself on plain speaking, on refusing to engage in the elaborate social games that governed so much of aristocratic life. It was unsettling to find those same qualities reflected in a stable servant who had somehow captured her future husband's attention. "Edmund speaks well of your work," Constance said carefully, watching Eliza's reaction closely. A flicker of something crossed Eliza's face, quickly suppressed, but Constance, trained by years of navigating the subtle currents of society, caught it clearly enough. "His lordship is kind to notice the stable staff at all, my lady. Many gentlemen in his position pay little attention to such matters." "Indeed," Constance said, "though I have noticed he pays rather more attention to this particular matter than most others on his estate." The words hung in the air between them, direct enough that Eliza could no longer pretend to misunderstand their meaning. She lowered her eyes, her hands stilling on the brush she held. "My lady, I assure you, nothing improper has occurred between myself and his lordship. I know my place, and I have never sought to overstep it." "I did not accuse you of impropriety," Constance said, though her tone remained measured, careful. "I am simply observing what appears evident to anyone paying attention. Whether anything improper has occurred is, perhaps, a separate question from whether something has changed in his heart." Eliza said nothing, unable to offer any response that would not either betray Edmund's confidence or deepen Constance's suspicions further. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable, until Constance finally turned to leave, pausing once more at the stable entrance. "I do not blame you," Constance said, her voice softer than before, carrying an unexpected note of weariness. "You did not seek this situation. I understand well enough how these things happen, how feelings arrive uninvited and refuse to depart simply because circumstances demand otherwise. But I would ask you to remember, whatever exists or does not exist between you and Edmund, that an entire family's survival depends upon this marriage proceeding as planned. That is not a small matter to set aside for the sake of feelings, however genuine they might be." She left without waiting for a response, her composed exterior giving no indication of the turmoil that churned beneath it. Constance had built her entire approach to this marriage on the foundation of mutual respect and practical honesty, believing that a union free of romantic illusion might prove more stable than one built on passion alone. She had not anticipated the particular pain of discovering that her future husband's heart, whether he admitted it openly or not, had already begun to wander elsewhere before their wedding had even taken place. That evening, Constance requested a private conversation with Edmund, and he agreed, sensing from her tone that the discussion would prove difficult. They met in the small study adjoining the main library, away from the ears of household staff, the door closed firmly behind them. "I visited your stables today," Constance said without preamble, watching his face carefully as she spoke. "I met the young woman everyone speaks of." Edmund felt his stomach tighten, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "Eliza Hartley. She works with the horses." "She does more than work with horses, Edmund, and we both know it." Constance's voice remained steady, though Edmund could hear the effort it cost her to maintain such composure. "I am not a foolish woman. I have watched you grow distant these past weeks, distracted, your mind clearly occupied elsewhere. I do not require a confession to understand what has changed." Edmund was silent for a long moment, weighing his response carefully. He had never intended to deceive Constance, had never set out to develop feelings that complicated their carefully arranged future, and yet here he stood, unable to deny what she had so clearly observed. "I have not acted improperly," he said finally. "I give you my word on that. But I will not insult you by pretending nothing has changed within my own heart." Constance nodded slowly, her expression a complicated mixture of hurt and understanding that Edmund had not expected. "I appreciate your honesty, at least. It is more than many men in your position would offer." "Constance," Edmund said, moving toward her slightly, though he stopped himself, uncertain of what comfort he could rightfully offer given the circumstances. "I entered this arrangement believing I could build a respectful, practical life with you, and I still believe we could manage such a life if circumstances demanded it. I have not decided to abandon our arrangement. My family's survival depends on this marriage, and I understand that responsibility as clearly as I ever have." "But you love her," Constance said, not as a question but as a simple statement of fact she had already accepted. Edmund did not answer immediately, the weight of confirming such a truth aloud, to the very woman he was contracted to marry, feeling almost unbearably heavy. But he had promised himself, weeks ago, standing in that lantern-lit stable, that he would not build his future on dishonesty, regardless of how complicated the truth might prove. "I believe I do," he said quietly, "though I have fought against acknowledging it for weeks, hoping it would simply fade into practical resignation, as I assumed such feelings should." Constance absorbed this admission with a stillness that unsettled Edmund more than any outburst of anger might have. She rose from her seat and walked slowly to the window, looking out over the darkened grounds of Ashworth Hall, her back to him for a long moment before she spoke again. "I will not pretend this does not wound my pride," she said finally, turning back to face him. "I entered this arrangement expecting respect, at minimum, and perhaps, in time, genuine affection built slowly through shared responsibility. I did not expect to discover that your heart had already found somewhere else to settle, before we had even exchanged our vows." "I am sorry," Edmund said, and he meant it fully, the weight of guilt pressing heavily against his chest. "You deserve far better than the circumstances I have placed you in." "Perhaps," Constance said, "though I wonder whether either of us truly deserves a marriage built entirely on practical necessity, regardless of where our hearts might wander." She paused, studying him with an expression that had shifted from hurt toward something more thoughtful, more considering. "Tell me honestly, Edmund. If circumstances did not demand this marriage, if your family's survival did not depend upon my father's fortune, would you still choose me?" The question hung heavy in the room, and Edmund understood that his answer, whatever it might be, would shape everything that followed. He owed her the truth, however difficult it might be to speak aloud. "I do not believe I would," he said quietly. "I would have great respect for you, Constance. I do respect you deeply. But respect alone, I have come to understand, is not the same as the love that shapes a genuinely fulfilling life together." Constance nodded slowly, absorbing his words with a composure that impressed him even as it broke something between them that could not easily be repaired. "Then we find ourselves in a rather difficult position, do we not? Bound by duty to a marriage neither of us can claim to fully desire, at least not in the way that truly matters." "What would you have me do?" Edmund asked, genuinely uncertain, torn between the honesty he had just offered and the practical reality of his family's desperate circumstances. "I do not know yet," Constance admitted. "I need time to consider what I want from this situation, separate from what duty demands. I would ask the same consideration of you, Edmund. Do not make any hasty decisions tonight in either direction. This matter deserves more careful thought than a single difficult conversation can provide." Edmund agreed, and Constance departed shortly after, leaving him alone in the study with thoughts churning too rapidly for any clear resolution. He had spoken honestly, perhaps more honestly than he had intended, and now the careful arrangement that had governed his future for months stood on uncertain ground, with no clear path forward that did not require sacrifice of some kind, whether of his family's financial security or of the honest feelings that had taken root so unexpectedly within his heart. Word of the private conversation between Edmund and Constance did not remain contained within the study walls for long. Household staff, ever attuned to shifts in the emotional currents of the families they served, began to whisper among themselves, and within days, rumors of trouble between the Duke and his intended bride had begun to circulate through Ashworth Hall's corridors, eventually reaching the ears of Lord Henry, who summoned his son to a conversation, Edmund had been dreading since the moment he first admitted his feelings for Eliza Hartley, even silently, to himself. Lord Henry stood by the fireplace in his private study when Edmund entered, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression carrying the particular sternness that had governed most of Edmund's childhood memories. Rain had returned to the estate that evening, tapping steadily against the windows, filling the silence that stretched between father and son before either spoke. "I am told," Henry began, without turning from the fire, "that you have had a difficult conversation with Lady Constance. I am told she left the estate rather quickly after your discussion, and that she has not yet confirmed when she intends to return." "We spoke honestly with one another," Edmund said carefully. "There were matters that needed addressing before we proceed further." Henry turned then, his eyes sharp with an anger Edmund had rarely seen directed at him so fully. "What matters, Edmund? What could possibly require such honesty that it drives away the one arrangement standing between this family and complete ruin?" Edmund considered lying, considered offering some vague explanation that would satisfy his father without revealing the full truth, but he found he no longer possessed the will to continue such careful deception, not after everything he had already admitted to Constance, not after everything he had come to understand about his own heart in recent weeks. "I have developed feelings for someone else," he said plainly. "I did not seek them, and I fought against acknowledging them for as long as I could, but I will not enter a marriage built entirely on dishonesty." Henry's face went pale, then flushed with a fury that Edmund had witnessed only rarely throughout his life. "Feelings for whom? Speak plainly, Edmund. I would rather understand the full extent of this disaster before deciding how to address it." "The young woman who works in our stables," Edmund said, forcing himself to meet his father's gaze despite the shame and defiance warring within him. "Eliza Hartley." For a long moment, Henry said nothing, simply staring at his son as though struggling to comprehend words that made no logical sense to him. Then slowly, his expression hardened into something colder and more dangerous than the anger that had preceded it. "A stable servant," he said finally, his voice low and controlled in a way that frightened Edmund more than shouting would have. "You would risk this family's entire future, everything generations of Ashworths have built and protected, for feelings toward a servant girl who tends horses for her daily bread." "I did not choose these feelings, father. I would have preferred, for the sake of simplicity, that they never existed at all. And yet they exist, and you have allowed them to jeopardize a marriage that would save this estate from complete collapse." Henry's voice rose now, the careful control breaking under the weight of his anger and fear. "Do you understand what happens if this marriage does not proceed, Edmund? Do you understand the creditors circling this family, waiting for any excuse to seize what remains of our land, our home, everything that bears our name? I have spent years managing this decline, watching everything my own father built slip further from our grasp, and I finally found a solution, a genuine path toward restoration, and you would abandon it for the sake of a passing infatuation with a servant." "It is not a passing infatuation," Edmund said, his own voice rising to match his father's intensity. "I have spent weeks trying to convince myself it was exactly that, hoping it would fade, hoping I could proceed with the marriage to Constance without complication. But it has not faded, father. If anything, it has grown deeper with each passing day, and I cannot in good conscience marry a woman while my heart belongs entirely to someone else." "Your heart," Henry said with bitter emphasis, "is a luxury this family cannot currently afford. Duty must come before feeling, Edmund. It has always been so, for men in our position. Did you imagine your marriage would be built on romantic passion? Did you imagine I married your mother for love alone, without regard for the practical benefits our union provided to both families?" Edmund had not expected this admission, and it struck him with unexpected force. "You did not love mother." Henry's expression flickered, something like old grief passing briefly across his hardened features before he composed himself once more. "I grew to love her in time, through years of shared responsibility and partnership. But our marriage began as an arrangement between families, exactly as yours was intended to begin. Love, when it arrives at all in marriages such as ours, arrives afterward, built through commitment and shared purpose, not beforehand through foolish infatuation with someone entirely unsuited to our position. Perhaps that worked for you and Mother, Edmund said. But I do not believe I can build the same foundation, not now that I understand what genuine connection feels like, what honesty between two people can offer that careful arrangement never could. Henry's jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a warning Edmund had never heard directed at him before. Hear me clearly, Edmund. If you abandon this marriage, if you choose a stable servant over the survival of everything our family has built across generations, I will not stand idly by and watch you destroy us. I will disown you if it comes to that. I will find another way to secure this family's future, whatever that requires, and you will find yourself without title, without inheritance, without the estate that has sustained our name for centuries. Do you understand what you would be sacrificing? The threat hung heavy in the room, and Edmund felt the full weight of everything his father described pressing down upon him. He thought of the tenants who depended on the estate for their livelihoods, of the servants who had served the family faithfully for generations, of the ancestral home that held centuries of history within its walls. He thought, too, of Eliza, of her father's failing health, of the impossible position his feelings had placed her in, a position that could destroy her family's already precarious standing if word of their connection spread further than it already had. I understand what I would be sacrificing, Edmund said quietly. I am not yet certain what decision I will make, Father. But I will not be threatened into a marriage built entirely on dishonesty, regardless of the consequences you describe. Henry studied his son for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, though whether it was grudging respect or renewed anger, Edmund could not clearly determine. You have until the wedding date to resolve this matter, Henry said finally, his voice cold and final. I expect you to proceed with the marriage as planned, regardless of whatever foolish feelings currently occupy your heart. If you cannot manage that, then you had best prepare yourself for the consequences I have described, because I will not hesitate to act on them. Edmund left the study that evening carrying a weight heavier than any he had known before, torn between the duty his father demanded and the honest feelings he could no longer deny. He walked, as he so often did during moments of turmoil, toward the stables, needing the quiet comfort of that familiar space, needing, more than anything, to see Eliza and find some clarity amid the chaos that had overtaken his carefully arranged life. He found her tending to her father instead, having received word earlier that evening that his condition had worsened. The small cottage at the edge of the estate grounds was dimly lit, and through the open door, Edmund could see Eliza kneeling beside her father's bed, her hand resting gently on his, her expression carrying an exhaustion and worry that struck Edmund deeply. He did not enter, not wishing to intrude on such a private moment, but Eliza noticed his presence at the doorway and rose quietly, stepping outside to speak with him, pulling the door partially closed behind her to allow her father rest. "How is he?" Edmund asked softly. "Weaker than before," Eliza said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "The physician says there is little more to be done beyond keeping him comfortable and hoping his strength returns." Edmund reached out instinctively, taking her hand in his own, a gesture that would have been entirely improper by every social standard he had been raised to respect, but which felt in that moment like the only honest thing he could offer her. "I am so sorry, Eliza. Whatever you need, whatever the estate can provide, please know it is yours without question." Eliza looked up at him, tears finally spilling over despite her efforts to remain composed, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply standing together in the quiet darkness outside her father's cottage, the weight of everything unspoken between them settling heavily in the space that separated their two very different worlds. "My father spoke of your visits earlier this evening," Eliza said finally, wiping her eyes and stepping back slightly, though she did not release his hand. "He told me to be careful, Edmund. He said a duke's attention, however genuine it might feel, can only bring difficulty to a family in our position. He fears what will happen to us if word of our connection reaches beyond the estate walls, particularly given the timing so close to your wedding. My father threatened to disown me tonight, Edmund said quietly, deciding honesty remained his only viable path forward, regardless of how difficult the truth might prove to share. If I do not proceed with the marriage to Constance, he says he will strip me of my title and inheritance entirely. Eliza's face paled, and she pulled her hand back slightly, though not entirely away from his grasp. Then you must proceed with the marriage, Edmund. You cannot sacrifice everything, your family's entire legacy, for feelings that can only bring us both ruin if we allow them to continue. I do not know what I will do, Edmund admitted. I only know that I cannot pretend these feelings do not exist, regardless of the consequences my father describes. You must think clearly, Eliza said, her voice firming with a resolve that Edmund recognized as her attempt to protect him from a decision she feared would destroy his future entirely. I will not be the reason you lose everything your family has built across generations. My father is dying, Edmund. I cannot risk losing my position here as well, the only security I have left to care for him in his final months. We must end whatever has grown between us before it destroys us both. The words struck Edmund like a physical blow, though he understood, even through his pain, the genuine fear and practical necessity driving her decision. Is that truly what you wish? He asked quietly. Eliza's composure wavered, tears threatening once more despite her evident effort to remain strong. It is what must happen, regardless of what I wish, she said finally. Please, Edmund, proceed with your marriage to Lady Constance. Save your family's estate, honor your father's wishes, and allow me to care for mine without the added danger of scandal hanging over both our heads. She returned to her father's cottage without waiting for his response, closing the door quietly behind her, leaving Edmund standing alone in the darkness, the rain beginning to fall once more around him as he made his way slowly back toward the main house, his heart torn between duty, family legacy, and a love he had never expected to find, now seemingly slipping away before he had even fully claimed it. The days that followed brought a strained distance between Edmund and Eliza that neither of them had wanted but both believed necessary. Edmund threw himself into estate business, meeting with creditors, reviewing accounts, attempting to distract his restless mind with the practical matters that had always defined his responsibilities as future head of the family. Constance returned to Ashworth Hall briefly to discuss wedding logistics, her manner cool but professional, neither of them addressing directly the difficult conversation that had passed between them, though its shadow lingered over every interaction. The wedding date drew closer with each passing day, now less than 2 weeks away, and Edmund found himself trapped in a state of miserable indecision, unable to fully commit to the marriage his family's survival demanded, yet equally unable to imagine a path forward that did not require abandoning either his duty or his heart entirely. It was during this uneasy period that a violent storm swept across the region, arriving with little warning on a gray afternoon that quickly darkened into something far more dangerous than the household had anticipated. Thunder rolled continuously across the sky, and lightning split the darkness in jagged, brilliant flashes that set every animal on the estate into a state of nervous agitation. The stable staff worked quickly to secure the horses, moving them into their stalls, calming what animals they could, though the increasing violence of the storm made their efforts increasingly difficult. Edmund had been reviewing ledgers in his study when word reached him that several horses had grown dangerously agitated, the great stallion in particular thrashing against its stall door with enough force that the stable staff feared it might break free entirely. He rushed toward the stables immediately, some instinct pulling him there despite the danger the storm presented, and found chaos upon his arrival. Rain poured in heavy sheets across the yard, lightning illuminating the panicked scene in brief, stark flashes, and above the roar of thunder, he could hear the stallion's terrified screaming from within its stall. Eliza was already there, having rushed from her father's cottage the moment she heard the commotion, working alongside Mr. Coleman and 2 other grooms to keep the frightened animals as calm as possible amid the storm's violence. But the stallion, always the most volatile of the estate's horses, had worked itself into a state of pure panic that no amount of careful handling seemed capable of soothing. "The latch has weakened," Mr. Coleman shouted over the storm, struggling to secure the stall door against the stallion's repeated assaults. If he breaks through, he could injure himself badly, or worse, escape into the yard entirely. Edmund moved forward to help, but at that exact moment, a tremendous crack of thunder split the sky directly overhead, and the stallion, already pushed beyond its limits of tolerance, threw itself against the weakened stall door with such force that the latch finally gave way entirely. The great horse burst free into the chaos of the stable, its eyes wild with terror, its powerful body crashing through anything in its path as it sought escape from the storm's relentless violence. Everyone scattered, the grooms pressing themselves against the walls to avoid the panicked animal's flailing hooves. But Edmund, positioned directly in the stallion's escape path, found himself unable to move quickly enough as the terrified horse charged toward the open stable doorway leading out into the storm-lashed yard. The stallion's shoulder caught him hard, throwing him sideways into a stack of hay bales, and he struck his head against the solid wooden support beam behind them, pain exploding through his skull as darkness threatened to claim his vision entirely. He was dimly aware of shouting, of chaos continuing around him, of the stallion's hoofbeats thundering away into the storm-darkened yard beyond the stable. He tried to push himself upright, but a wave of dizziness overtook him, and he sank back against the hay bales, blood trickling warm against his temple where his head had struck the beam. "Edmund," Eliza's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with panic as she rushed to his side, kneeling beside him in the scattered hay, her hands moving quickly to assess the wound at his temple. "Stay still. You have struck your head badly." "The horse," Edmund managed, his voice thick and unsteady. "Someone must catch him before he injures himself, or worse, reaches the road." "Mr. Coleman and the others are already pursuing him," Eliza said firmly, her attention remaining fixed on Edmund despite the continuing chaos of the storm outside. "You are the one who needs attention right now." She worked quickly, tearing a strip from her own apron to press against the wound at his temple, her hands steady despite the evident fear in her expression. The same calm competence she brought to every frightened animal now directed entirely toward him. Edmund watched her through blurred vision, struck even in his pain by the fierce determination in her face, the complete absence of hesitation as she cared for him without regard for propriety or position. "You should not risk yourself for me," he said weakly, though he made no move to push her away. "I'm not risking anything beyond a torn apron," Eliza said, though her voice trembled slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure. "Now be quiet and let me see how badly you are injured." Outside, the storm continued its violent assault upon the estate grounds, and somewhere beyond the stable walls, the terrified stallion continued its panicked flight, pursued by Mr. Coleman and the other grooms who fought against wind and rain to bring the animal safely under control before it could injure itself or anyone unfortunate enough to cross its path. But within the stable, Edmund's attention remained fixed entirely on Eliza, on the gentle but firm pressure of her hands against his wound, on the fierce protectiveness in her expression that spoke more clearly than any words could of feelings she had spent weeks trying to suppress for both their sakes. "I need to get you to the house," Eliza said, once the bleeding had slowed sufficiently. "This wound needs proper attention beyond what I can offer here." She helped him rise slowly, supporting much of his weight as dizziness continued to plague him, and together they made their way carefully through the storm toward the main house, rain soaking through their clothes entirely by the time they reached the shelter of the entrance hall. Household staff rushed forward immediately upon seeing Edmund's injury, calling for the physician, for warm blankets, for anything that might ease his discomfort. And in the chaos that followed, Eliza found herself pushed gently but firmly aside by servants eager to attend to their master's needs. She remained in the entrance hall for a long while after Edmund had been carried upstairs to his chambers, uncertain whether her presence would be welcomed or considered improper given the circumstances, uncertain whether the fierce fear that had gripped her heart during those chaotic moments in the stable had been visible to anyone watching, uncertain of anything beyond the overwhelming relief that Edmund's injury, while painful, did not appear life-threatening. It was nearly an hour later, after the physician had examined Edmund and confirmed that his wound, while requiring stitches, presented no immediate danger to his life, that Lady Margaret found Eliza still waiting quietly near the entrance hall, her clothes still damp from the storm, her expression carrying a worry that Margaret, watching carefully, recognized as far deeper than simple concern for an employer's well-being. "You saved my son's life today," Margaret said, approaching Eliza with an unexpected gentleness. "Mr. Coleman told me what happened in the stable. Your quick action likely prevented far more serious injury." "I only did what needed doing, my lady," Eliza said, lowering her eyes respectfully. "Anyone would have done the same." "Perhaps," Margaret said thoughtfully, studying the young woman before her with new interest. "Though I suspect not everyone would have remained so steady in the midst of such chaos, nor shown quite such fierce concern for a man's welfare beyond simple duty." She paused, watching Eliza's reaction carefully. "My son speaks of you, you know." "Not directly, not in words I could easily repeat, but in the way his attention drifts toward the stables more often than any practical estate matter requires, in the restlessness that has clearly gripped him these past weeks." Eliza's face flushed, uncertain how to respond to such a direct observation from the Duke's own mother. "I have never sought to overstep my position, my lady. I know the difference between his lordship's station and my own." "I do not doubt your intentions," Margaret said gently, "but intentions and feelings, I have learned across many years, do not always align neatly with one another." She reached out, taking Eliza's damp hand in her own with unexpected warmth. "Go home and rest, my dear. You have had a difficult day, and I imagine your own father requires your attention as well. Edmund will recover, thanks in large part to your quick thinking. Whatever else remains uncertain, that much is settled." Eliza departed shortly after, walking home through the diminishing rain toward her father's cottage, her mind churning with everything that had transpired that afternoon, with Lady Margaret's unexpected kindness, and the clear implication in her words that she, too, had noticed the connection growing between her son and a stable servant far below his station. Edmund, meanwhile, lay in his chambers as the physician completed the stitches at his temple, his thoughts returning repeatedly to those crucial moments in the stable, to Eliza's steady hands tending his wound amid the storm's chaos, to the fierce concern in her expression that had spoken more honestly than any careful words could have of feelings she had tried so hard to suppress. The accident, painful as it had been, had cleared something in his mind that weeks of careful deliberation had failed to accomplish entirely. He understood now, with a clarity that pain and danger had somehow sharpened rather than clouded, exactly what he wanted from his future, exactly whose face he wished to see beside him through whatever difficulties life might present. The practical considerations that had governed his engagement to Constance had not vanished. His family's financial difficulties remained as pressing as ever. His father's threat of disinheritance still loomed over any decision he might make. But lying there in his chambers, his head throbbing beneath fresh stitches, Edmund found that the fear of losing everything his family had built no longer outweighed the fear of losing Eliza entirely, of watching her disappear back into a careful, guarded distance that denied both of them the honest connection they had discovered together. He would need to speak with his father again, would need to find some path forward that honored both his family's genuine needs and the truth of his own heart, however difficult that path might prove to navigate. But for the first time since this entire complicated situation had begun weeks earlier, Edmund felt a settled certainty replace the anxious indecision that had plagued him for so long. He knew, without further doubt or hesitation, exactly what he intended to do. News of the stable accident spread quickly through the county, as such dramatic events always did, and within days, the story had transformed through repeated telling into something far more scandalous than the simple truth. Whispers reached Constance before Edmund could properly explain the situation himself. rumors suggesting that a stable servant had shown improper familiarity in caring for his wounds, that the Duke's affections had shifted entirely away from his intended bride toward a woman entirely unsuited to his station. Constance arrived at Ashworth Hall 3 days after the accident, her composure carefully maintained despite the evident tension in her expression. "I have heard several versions of what happened during the storm," she said. Once they were alone in the drawing room, the door closed against curious household ears. "I would prefer to hear the truth directly from you, rather than continue relying on second-hand accounts filtered through gossip." Edmund, still recovering from his injury, a bandage visible beneath his carefully arranged hair, recounted the events honestly: the stallion's escape, his own injury, Eliza's quick action in tending his wound before he could be moved safely to the house. He did not embellish the story, nor did he attempt to diminish the significance of what had passed between himself and Eliza in the days and weeks leading up to that dramatic afternoon. "I intend to end our engagement, Constance," he said finally, once he had finished his account. "I have spent weeks trying to convince myself that duty alone could sustain a marriage between us, and I believe, given time and mutual effort, we might have built something workable together. But I cannot in good conscience proceed with our wedding while my heart remains entirely elsewhere. You deserve a husband capable of offering his full devotion, not one who enters marriage already divided in his affections." Constance absorbed this declaration with the same composed stillness she had shown during their previous difficult conversation, though Edmund noted a subtle shift in her posture, something that looked almost like relief hidden beneath her careful control. "I have given considerable thought to our situation these past days," she said slowly. "I confess I have felt a similar uncertainty growing within myself, though I did not wish to acknowledge it while matters remained so unclear between us." "What do you mean?" Edmund asked, genuinely surprised by this admission. "I mean," Constance said, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time in weeks, "that I have never truly wished for a marriage built entirely on practical arrangement, regardless of how sensibly I approached our engagement from the beginning. I convinced myself I could be satisfied with respect and comfortable partnership, but watching you struggle so genuinely with feelings for someone else has made me realize how deeply I, too, long for a marriage built on something more than practical necessity." Edmund studied her carefully, uncertain whether to feel relief or renewed guilt at her words. "Is there someone else who has captured your attention as well?" Constance's smile deepened slightly, a hint of color rising in her cheeks that Edmund had never witnessed before during their entire acquaintance. "There is a gentleman, a naval officer named Frederick Lansing, whom I met several months ago at my cousin's wedding. Nothing improper has occurred between us, given my prior commitment to you, but I confess my thoughts have drifted toward him rather more often than I initially admitted to myself." The revelation brought unexpected lightness to a conversation Edmund had anticipated would prove far more painful. "Then perhaps," he said carefully, "ending our engagement serves both our interests more genuinely than either of us initially realized." "Perhaps," Constance agreed. "Though I must ask, Edmund, what will become of your family's finances if our marriage does not proceed? I know well enough how desperately Ashworth Hall requires my father's fortune." Edmund's expression sobered at this practical reminder of everything still at stake. "I do not yet know," he admitted honestly. "My father has threatened to disown me entirely if I abandon this arrangement. I may lose my title, my inheritance, everything my family has built across generations. But I have come to believe that some sacrifices, however costly, matter less than living honestly according to what my heart has clearly chosen." Constance studied him for a long moment, something like genuine respect entering her expression. "You are a braver man than I initially gave you credit for, Edmund Ashworth. I wish you well, truly, whatever path you choose to follow. And I hope, in time, you might extend the same goodwill toward my own happiness, should circumstances allow me to pursue it." They parted amicably that afternoon, their engagement formally dissolved through mutual agreement rather than bitter conflict. though both understood that the practical consequences of this decision would prove far more complicated to navigate than their conversation itself had been. Constance departed Ashworth Hall for what both suspected might be the final time, leaving Edmund to face the far more difficult conversation that awaited him with his father. Lord Henry's reaction, when Edmund informed him that evening of the engagement's dissolution, proved every bit as severe as he had anticipated. The confrontation stretched long into the night, Henry's fury manifesting in cold, controlled anger far more unsettling than any outburst might have been, punctuated by repeated warnings of the ruin that awaited the family without Constance's fortune to save them. "You have destroyed everything," Henry said finally, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and barely contained rage. "Generations of careful stewardship, and you would throw it all away for a servant girl who tends horses. I hope she is worth the price you will pay for this decision, Edmund, because I promise you, that price will prove steeper than you currently imagine." "I understand the risk I am taking," Edmund said steadily, though the weight of his father's disappointment pressed heavily upon him. "But I cannot build my life on dishonesty, father, regardless of the practical benefits such dishonesty might provide. I would rather face genuine hardship with honesty intact than comfortable security built on a lie." Henry studied his son for a long moment, something shifting subtly in his expression, though the anger remained clearly dominant. "I will need time to consider how to proceed," he said finally. "Do not assume this conversation concludes the matter entirely. There may yet be consequences you have not fully anticipated." Edmund left the study that night uncertain of exactly what those consequences might entail, but resolved nonetheless in the decision he had made. He made his way toward the stables despite the late hour, needing desperately to speak with Eliza, to share with her everything that had transpired, though he understood the conversation ahead would prove complicated given her earlier insistence that they end whatever connection had grown between them. He found her in the small cottage, sitting quietly beside her father, who appeared to be resting more peacefully than in recent days. She met him at the door, surprise evident in her expression at his late-night visit. "Edmund, what are you doing here at this hour?" "Your injury is healing well enough," Edmund interrupted gently. "I needed to speak with you, Eliza. I have ended my engagement to Constance." Eliza's breath caught, her expression shifting rapidly through surprise, fear, and something that looked almost like hope before settling into careful concern. "Edmund, what have you done? Your father is furious, yes. He has threatened disinheritance, exactly as he warned he would." Edmund stepped closer, taking her hands in his own despite the impropriety of such a gesture at her father's doorstep. "But I could not proceed with a marriage that denied the truth of my own heart, Eliza. I love you. I have tried for weeks to convince myself otherwise, to accept the practical arrangement my family required. But I cannot continue pretending my feelings for you are anything less than genuine and permanent." Tears filled Eliza's eyes, though whether from joy or fear, Edmund could not immediately determine. "You have risked everything," she said softly. "Your title, your inheritance, your family's entire future. I never wanted to be the cause of such sacrifice." "You are not the cause," Edmund said firmly. "The choice was entirely my own, made with clear understanding of every consequence involved. I would rather face uncertainty with you beside me than comfortable security built on a life I could never truly want." "But what will you do now?" Eliza asked, practical concerns clearly warring with the emotion evident in her expression. "If your father truly disowns you, how will you manage? The estate, the title, everything you have known your entire life." "I do not yet know the full answer," Edmund admitted honestly. "But I know I do not wish to face whatever comes without you beside me, if you are willing to risk uncertainty alongside me. I understand I am asking a great deal, given everything you and your father have already endured. I would not blame you for choosing caution over such an uncertain future." Eliza was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an expression that carried both fear and a growing, unmistakable resolve. "My father always taught me that horses know the true character of a person, that fear cannot hide behind fine words or careful appearances," she said finally. "I have watched you these past weeks, Edmund, watched you struggle honestly with an impossible situation, watched you choose truth over comfortable deception even when the cost proved steep. I do not know what our future holds, but I know I would rather face uncertainty with a man of genuine character than security with anyone less honest." Relief and joy flooded through Edmund at her words, though the practical difficulties still awaiting them remained as daunting as ever. Whatever Lord Henry decided in the coming days, whatever consequences awaited Edmund's decision to abandon the practical marriage his family had so desperately needed, he understood now that he would face those consequences with Eliza beside him, and that understanding, however uncertain the future remained, brought him more genuine peace than any carefully arranged security ever could have provided. The days following Edmund's declaration to his father passed in a tense, uncertain silence. Lord Henry retreated into his study for hours at a time, refusing most company, wrestling privately with the wreckage of a plan he had spent months carefully constructing. Edmund, for his part, continued visiting Eliza and her father each day, no longer concerned with hiding his affection, though he remained careful to protect her reputation from further gossip until matters with his father reached some resolution. Lady Margaret proved an unexpected ally during this difficult period. She sought Edmund out one quiet afternoon, finding him walking the gardens alone, his thoughts occupied with the uncertain future stretching before him. "Your father is not as immovable as he appears," Margaret said, joining him along the garden path, her expression thoughtful. "He is frightened, Edmund, more than angry, though anger proves easier for a man like your father to express than genuine fear. He has spent his entire adult life watching this estate decline, feeling powerless to prevent it, and Constance's fortune represented the first genuine solution he had found in years. Losing that solution terrifies him far more than your choice of Eliza actually offends him." "What would you have me do?" Edmund asked. "I cannot undo my decision, nor would I wish to, regardless of the difficulty it has caused." "I am not suggesting you undo anything," Margaret said gently. "I am suggesting you help your father see that other solutions exist, solutions that do not require sacrificing your happiness for the family's survival. Have you considered that the estate's difficulties, while serious, might be addressed through means other than marrying wealth entirely?" Edmund considered his mother's words carefully over the following days, and gradually, a plan began forming in his mind, one that drew upon skills and knowledge he had perhaps undervalued throughout his life, distracted as he had always been by the singular focus on marriage as the estate's only viable salvation. He approached his father's steward, Mr. Coleman's cousin who managed the estate's remaining productive lands, and began reviewing every possible avenue for restoring the family's finances through more gradual, sustainable means. He discovered that several distant parcels of Ashworth land, currently leased for minimal income, could be developed more productively if properly invested in, particularly given Eliza's evident expertise with horses, an expertise that might be turned toward breeding and training horses for sale to wealthy buyers across the county. An enterprise that required initial investment, but promised substantial returns given the reputation Eliza had already built through her remarkable skill. Edmund presented this proposal to his father nearly 2 weeks after their initial confrontation, armed with careful calculations and a genuine, detailed plan rather than simple emotional appeal. "I understand you believe Constance's fortune represented our only path forward," he said, spreading his papers across his father's desk. "But I believe there exists another path, slower perhaps, requiring more patient effort, but one that does not require sacrificing genuine happiness for practical survival." Henry studied the papers carefully, his expression skeptical at first, though gradually softening as he reviewed the detailed projections Edmund had assembled. "This horse breeding enterprise you describe, it depends heavily upon this stable girl's particular skill." "Eliza's skill is remarkable, father, recognized already by neighboring estates, including George Pembroke's own interest in employing her himself." If we invest properly in developing this enterprise, drawing upon her expertise and my own management of the practical business elements, I believe we could generate income substantial enough to address our debts gradually, without requiring the immediate windfall Constance's fortune would have provided, but without the compromise such a marriage would have demanded of my own happiness. Henry was silent for a long time, studying the papers, weighing considerations that had governed his entire approach to the estate's survival for years. "This will require significant sacrifice," he said finally. "Reduced spending, careful management, years of patient rebuilding rather than the swift solution I had hoped marriage would provide." "I understand," Edmund said. "But I am prepared to make that sacrifice, Father, prepared to work diligently toward rebuilding this family's fortune through honest effort rather than convenient arrangement. I ask only that you give me the opportunity to attempt this path before condemning me entirely for abandoning the marriage you had planned." Henry studied his son for a long moment, something shifting slowly in his expression, years of careful control gradually giving way to something more vulnerable, more genuinely paternal than Edmund had witnessed in a very long time. "Your grandfather built this estate through exactly such patient, honest effort," he said quietly. "I had perhaps forgotten that lesson, distracted as I became by more immediate solutions to problems that patient effort might have addressed all along, had I possessed the courage to pursue them properly." "Then you will consider my proposal?" Edmund asked, allowing himself a cautious hope for the first time since this difficult conversation had begun. "I will consider it," Henry said, "though I will require considerable evidence of its viability before fully committing the estate's remaining resources toward such an uncertain enterprise. And Edmund," he added, his voice softening further, "I owe you an apology, I think, for threatening consequences I am not certain I ever truly intended to enact. I was frightened, and fear made me cruel in ways I regret. I do not wish to lose my son over a decision that, perhaps, deserved more careful consideration than my initial anger allowed." The reconciliation that followed proved gradual rather than immediate, built through weeks of careful demonstration, as Edmund and Eliza worked together developing the breeding enterprise that would eventually transform Ashworth Hall's fortunes. Eliza's reputation for skill with difficult horses spread quickly once word circulated that she now managed a formal breeding program under the estate's backing, and wealthy buyers from across the county began seeking out Ashworth-bred horses, drawn by tales of animals trained with a gentleness and skill that produced remarkably well-tempered, reliable mounts. Lord Henry watched this transformation unfold with gradually diminishing skepticism, and by the time winter arrived, bringing with it the first substantial payments from horse sales that had generated income beyond even Edmund's optimistic projections, he had fully embraced the new direction his son had chosen for the estate's future. It was during this same winter that Edmund formally proposed to Eliza, though the moment came not through elaborate ceremony, but through a quiet evening in the stable where their connection had first begun, standing beside the great stallion that had once thrown every handler except her, now calm and settled under her patient care. "I know this is not the proposal you might have imagined for a duke," Edmund said, kneeling in the straw beside her, "but I find I want nothing more elaborate than this exactly here, where everything between us truly began." Eliza, tears of joy rather than fear filling her eyes this time, accepted without hesitation, and their engagement, unlike the practical arrangement that had preceded it, was celebrated throughout Ashworth Hall with genuine warmth from household staff who had watched their careful courtship unfold with growing affection over the preceding months. Their wedding took place the following spring, a simpler affair than the elaborate ceremony that had once been planned for Constance, but filled with a genuine joy that Edmund had never anticipated experiencing at his own marriage. Eliza's father, though frail, lived to see his daughter married, his health having stabilized somewhat under the improved circumstances that Edmund's care and the estate's growing prosperity had provided. Lord Henry, standing beside his wife as the ceremony concluded, watched his son with an expression of genuine pride that had been largely absent throughout the difficult months preceding this joyful occasion. Constance sent her congratulations from a distance, having herself become engaged to Frederick Lansing shortly after the naval officer's return from his most recent assignment. Their own courtship blossoming into genuine affection that Constance had once believed impossible for herself to experience. The two former intended spouses maintained a cordial, distant friendship in the years that followed, occasionally exchanging letters that spoke of their respective happiness with a warmth neither had anticipated feeling toward the other given their complicated shared history. Ashworth Hall's fortunes continued their gradual but steady improvement over the following years. The breeding enterprise Edmund and Eliza had built together, growing into one of the most respected operations in the county, drawing buyers from increasingly distant regions eager to acquire horses trained under Eliza's remarkable expertise. The estate's debts, once seemingly insurmountable, diminished steadily under careful management and honest, patient effort, until Ashworth Hall stood once more as a respected, financially secure property. Its restoration built not upon a marriage of convenience, but upon genuine partnership, hard work, and the kind of love that Edmund had once believed impossible for a man in his position to experience. Edmund often reflected, during quiet evenings spent with Eliza in the very stables where their story had begun, on how close he had come to accepting a life built entirely on practical arrangement, on duty divorced from genuine feeling, and how grateful he remained that circumstances, and his own eventual courage, had led him instead toward a marriage built on honesty, partnership, and love that had only deepened with each passing season they spent building their shared future together. 5 years passed, and Ashworth Hall bore little resemblance to the struggling estate Edmund had once feared losing entirely. The breeding program had expanded far beyond its modest beginnings, now employing a dozen skilled handlers trained personally by Eliza, whose reputation had grown so significant that even royal stables had once sent inquiries regarding her methods. The stallion that had once thrown every rider except her had become the foundation sire of a bloodline now recognized throughout the country for its remarkable temperament and strength. Animals sought after by breeders and riders who valued gentleness alongside power. Edmund had grown into his role as head of the estate with a confidence that surprised even himself. No longer the anxious, dutiful son constantly measuring his choices against inherited expectation, but a man who had learned that genuine partnership, whether in marriage or in business, produced results that calculation and arrangement alone could never achieve. He managed the estate's finances with careful attention, having learned valuable lessons from the near disaster of those early difficult months, ensuring that Ashworth Hall would never again find itself teetering so precariously close to ruin. Lord Henry, in his later years, had softened considerably from the stern, anxious man who had once threatened to disown his only son. He spent his days now walking the grounds with his grandchildren, 2 boys and a girl who had inherited their mother's easy way with animals and their father's quiet, thoughtful nature. He often told visitors, with evident pride, the story of how his son had risked everything for love, and how that risk had ultimately saved the family more thoroughly than any arranged marriage ever could have accomplished. Eliza's father had passed peacefully 2 years after her wedding, having lived long enough to see his daughter's happiness fully secured, long enough to hold his first grandchild in his weakened arms, and know that the family line he had feared might end in poverty and struggle would instead continue in comfort and genuine joy. Eliza kept his memory alive through small traditions, teaching her own children the same patient, gentle approach to animals that her father had taught her, ensuring that his legacy, though he had never held wealth or title, continued to shape the family's character in ways far more valuable than any inheritance of gold could have provided. Constance and Frederick had married the year following Edmund and Eliza's own wedding, and the two couples had gradually become genuine friends over the years, their shared history no longer a source of awkwardness, but rather a curious bond that connected their families in unexpected ways. Constance often visited Ashworth Hall with her own growing family, and she and Eliza had developed a friendship built on mutual respect that neither could have anticipated during those tense early conversations, when Constance had first discovered the truth of Edmund's wandering heart. "I sometimes think we did each other a great favor," Constance remarked to Eliza during one such visit, watching their children play together in the gardens while their husbands discussed estate matters nearby. "Had you not entered his life when you did, I might have spent my entire marriage wondering what genuine passion truly felt like, settling for comfortable respect when something far greater existed within my reach all along." "I never intended to disrupt your plans," Eliza said, as she had said many times before, though the guilt that had once accompanied such words had long since faded into simple, honest reflection. "I know," Constance said, smiling warmly, "and that, I think, is precisely why everything worked out as it should have. Neither of us sought to hurt the other. We simply followed honesty toward the futures we were always meant to find." George Pembroke, who had once jokingly threatened to steal Eliza away to his own stables, eventually married a woman of his own choosing, a spirited widow he had met during his travels who shared his easy charm and adventurous spirit. He remained a close friend to Edmund throughout the years, often visiting Ashworth Hall to admire the breeding program's continued success, and to tease his old friend gently about the unlikely path that had led him toward such genuine happiness. The village surrounding Ashworth Hall had also benefited considerably from the estate's restored prosperity. Tenants who had once feared losing their homes to the family's mounting debts now enjoyed renewed stability, their livelihood secured by an estate that had learned, through hard experience, the value of honest partnership over convenient shortcuts. Edmund made it a point, throughout his years managing the property, to remember the lesson his own near disaster had taught him, that true security came not from desperate arrangements made in fear, but from patient, honest effort built upon genuine care for the people and animals under his responsibility. Eliza, for her part, never forgot the woman she had been when Edmund first noticed her feeding his horses in the quiet morning light, never allowed the comfort of her new position to distance her from the practical, grounded values that had shaped her entire life before fortune changed so dramatically in her favor. She continued working directly with the horses herself, refusing to simply oversee the breeding program from a distance, finding in that daily, hands-on labor a connection to her roots that she treasured deeply, regardless of the title and comfort that now surrounded her days. On quiet evenings, when the household had settled and their children slept soundly upstairs, Edmund and Eliza often found themselves returning to the stables together, walking slowly among the horses that had first brought them into each other's lives. The same gentle ritual that had defined their courtship years earlier now serving as a cherished reminder of everything they had risked and everything they had gained through that risk. "Do you ever wonder," Eliza asked one such evening, leaning against Edmund's shoulder as they watched the stallion, now gray with age but still magnificent, graze peacefully in its paddock, "what might have happened had you never come down those steps that first morning? Had you simply continued toward your marriage with Constance without ever truly noticing me?" "I think about it sometimes," Edmund admitted, wrapping his arm around her. "And every time I feel an overwhelming gratitude that circumstances unfolded exactly as they did. I might have built a comfortable, respectable life with Constance, one built on mutual practical benefit and careful arrangement. But I would never have known this, the particular joy of a marriage built on genuine partnership, of watching someone I love pour her heart into work she genuinely cherishes, of raising children who understand that love, real love, is always worth the risk it demands." Eliza smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the evening light faded gently over Ashworth Hall's restored grounds, over stables filled with horses trained through patient kindness rather than fear, over an estate that had learned, through one duke's willingness to choose honesty over convenient arrangement, that the most valuable inheritances were rarely the ones written into careful legal contracts, but rather the ones built slowly, steadily, through years of genuine devotion between two people who had chosen each other freely, against every practical expectation placed upon them. The story of the Duke who had been set to marry for money, only to change his mind upon noticing the quiet, remarkable woman feeding his horses, became something of a local legend throughout the county in the years that followed, told and retold among neighboring estates as an example of how genuine character, once recognized, could reshape even the most carefully arranged of futures. But for Edmund and Eliza themselves, it was never simply a story told for entertainment or inspiration. It was the quiet, ongoing reality of their daily lives, built one honest choice at a time, sustained through years of patient effort and genuine partnership. A love story that had begun in a stable yard on an ordinary gray morning and continued steadily and faithfully through every season that followed.